how your career got started, Mark. How you got into music, what inspired you, what has your journey been so far?
Well, probably I would say 90% of the guys my age would probably have the same story at the start, which is that we saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan when we were little kids. I think I was 6 or so, and it just changed my life, changed the world, really. And I played music before that because I played piano. I started when I was about 3 because my brother played piano and he was older than me, so I wanted to kind of copy him, and I liked the piano. And then, of course, when the Beatles showed up, it's all about guitar, and I switched over. And really, from that point on, I have played music. I've never not known what I wanted to do. I wanted to write songs. I have music inside my blood, and when you have music in your blood, you kind of can't get rid of it. It's kind of a curse and kind of a blessing.
Right.
So I followed the path of whatever it took. I mean, I wrote music all through high school. I had a band, and we did all original music, and it was quite complex music. This is in an era when, Genesis and Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and those groups were really popular. And I really was attracted to that music because it combined my classical sensibility with my pop sensibilities and kind of into an interesting mixture. Strangely enough, I went on to produce Emerson, Lake and Palmer later in my career. So it's very weird how all this, and Yes. So it's very weird how all this stuff happened. But I eventually found my way, and it's interesting you bring it up because the director who gave me my biggest break was the director that did Twister, and Jan de Bont, and he gave me my break on Speed, which was a $30 million picture, which is small by some means, and he really took a chance on me doing it. He somehow knew I would be the right choice. I don't know how, but he believed in me, and that really set the stage for my movie career. That's where I kind of got credibility because that movie was, and is still revered by a lot of people and a lot of directors as just a real watershed action movie. So, and the score was unique. It was a different kind of score. And,
so what did Jan de Bont see in you, considering you had never done a film?
I've asked him that. I saw him not that long ago. They did an anniversary of Speed, and we did a little talk at a music store, a record store at Los Angeles. I couldn't believe how many people turned out for it. And I asked him that question. I said, Jan, I mean, I was in Hans Zimmer's studio, so I had some credibility because I was working with Hans, and that helped. But they had already hired Michael Kamen for Speed, and I still to this day don't understand why Jan thought, no, I want this guy to do it instead of Michael Kamen. But he got rid of Michael Kamen, who's a great composer, was a fantastic person and composer, and I felt really weird, but I got the job, and I lived and breathed it, and it really took off. And so, when Jan said, I have my next movie, and I went to, I'll never forget this, I went to his office and looked at a little bit of footage. And then he flew me to, I want to say Omaha. I could be wrong. I don't remember exactly where they filmed, but wherever they were filming, they flew me out there on the set. And I'll never forget it because they had these gigantic propellers blowing, they had a truck, the red truck, and underneath the truck with a camera fastened to the truck as it was going 60 miles an hour is Jan de Bont, filming upside down. And I just thought, what a maniac this guy is. He's out of his mind. But it was really fun, and the whole movie was really fun. It was such a good movie, and I got to explore some different ways to go, and it was a really enjoyable experience. Speed was kind of terrifying. I enjoyed it, but it was terrifying because it was really my first. I kept thinking any day I'm going to be fired. But by the time I did Twister, I was pretty confident, and I felt like I was doing some cool stuff. So.
Yeah, fear normally and motivates you to do great things, or completely takes you in the other direction. Um, and
Yes.
on the note of speed, I have to tell you. I mean, I know you know this, but I'm just telling you this. To this day, that theme, dun, 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 dun,
Yeah.
and the movie itself hasn't aged at all. At all. It is such a fantastic action film with such a great concept. And if you, I watched the trailer recently, just to kind of see how the trailer was done, and it makes it look like one of the things I noticed was Jeff Daniels' role was like, huge, even though we know what happens to his character,
Right.
And it's such a great film, and that one scene that never leaves my mind is which I'm pretty sure a lot of people, the baby stroller. When the bus hit baby stroller, and it just, your heart in your mouth. And even I know now it's going to happen, I still cringe. Like, what? But
yes, I love that, and I I have a 21-year-old daughter, so when she was about 16, I showed her Speed, and I hadn't seen it forever, and yeah, I felt the same way. I felt like, man, this really holds up. It's really fun. I love the elevator sequence. To start that movie with that whole elevator thing is so anti the bus, right? It's a still thing. It's thing that's stuck, whereas the bus is going. So it's like, it was such a great way to start the movie.
Yeah. And Mark, how did you let's go back a little bit before Speed. You were working with Hans. How did you work on his team or in his office or whatever that was? How did you make that transition into the score world, in Hans Zimmer's world?
Well, what happened? So I had a little studio in my house, very small, and I was always, as I told you, since I was 12, I was writing songs. So I always had material. I still have CDs full of my music recorded in garages with bands, and I have all of it. It's amazing. I still have it, but by that time, I was, writing for myself as an artist, and I had an LA producer. His name is John Van Tongeren, and his buddy was a fellow named Jay Rifkin, and Jay was an engineer, and Jay came over to mix my music, and he liked it, and he was impressed with it, and he said, "Have you ever written any instrumental music?" Well, yes, because I was doing documentaries, so I had a lot of instrumental music, and I had one particular demo that I did that was really quite strong. I think it was one of my better demos, and he said, "Can I have it?" And so I gave it to Jay, but I didn't know that Jay was partners with Hans Zimmer, and I didn't even know who Hans Zimmer was. So when he said he was partners with him, I was like, I don't know. I thought he was talking about the composer that wrote Miami Vice, but that's a different person. Next thing, I got a phone call from Hans, and he said, bring your equipment to my studio." So I just had, I could fit it in my trunk, and I had an old Buick, and I drove up to his place in Santa Monica and unloaded my stuff and set up. And I think it was Billy Idol coming in, and Billy and I worked on a song for Days of Thunder. I think that's where it started. And then, and then Hans would ask me to do commercials, or ask me to work on a series, or ask me, and I would do some of it at my house, and then I would sometimes bring my stuff in and do it at his place. Eventually, I worked on a movie called True Romance.
Yes.
And True Romance is kind of what turned on Jan de Bont. He heard some cues from that and thought they were really cool, and those were my cues. So I think that's kind of helped Jan with Speed.
Got it.
But you see, at the same time, I had a parallel career. I was also producing and writing songs for other artists. So I had written a song for Yes, and I co-produced that. And then I wrote a song for Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and I moved to England and produced their entire album for a year and a half. So I kind of had the scoring thing going and the song producing thing going. So it only seemed natural that one of the first big breaks besides Speed was The Lion King, because the first movie, Hans asked me to do the songs. He asked me to arrange and produce because the songs weren't sounding African. They were Elton songs, and they didn't really have a lot to do with an African feeling.
Right.
And Hans felt that I could do that because he had listened to other stuff that I did. So Speed and Lion King came out around the same time.
Yeah.
So that was a good jumping off point, you know.
Yes, and I mean, 80s was a great era for films, and 70s and 60s. 80s was the beginning, in my view, and please tell me if I'm wrong because you're the expert. 80s was the era of maybe slowly the very beginning of musical scores kind of coming into play, like Back to the Future, E.T., you know, John Williams stuff. But 90s, you know, especially with the film like The Rock, Speed, Twister, The Lion King, the scores became like that's how I got into scores. Like I think the album that got me into scores was Last of Mohicans. And,
oh yeah, Tucker Jones, right?
Yeah. To this day, I listen to that, 1492, Twister, Speed, The Rock, Tarzan, which you also did. You know, there's some great soundtracks, and I think that 90s era built a very strong fan base for score lovers. Would you say that's something that you witnessed too?
Well, yeah. Well, I would say that. See, I think that scores. Let's just go back to 50s, 60s. You know, scores were really based a lot more on jazz, which was the more of a flavor of earlier times. And when you get into the 60s and all the rock music, when they would do a rock score, it was never good. You know, it just didn't work. So that never worked. And I think then in the 70s, especially with John Williams, he realized, a great theme transcends the movie. I mean, you walk out of the theater singing the theme. So that was the 70s and all of that. And then I think what happened is technology kind of made it so that guys like me and guys like Hans, who were song guys, score guys, but song guys, and had come from a pop world, could kind of transfer into kind of a score world with thematic music that's memorable and accessible. And it wasn't really based on, it wasn't rock music and it wasn't jazz. It was maybe simpler than that or maybe more accessible than that. I'm not really sure, but kind of became its own thing.
Well, one unique thing about the 90s era, let's focus on your work, right? Like and I'm not a music expert. I know when I hear great music. I'm a filmmaker myself, but the element of using drums, right? Like you use it in Tarzan quite a bit. I don't know what the right terminology is, but it was just something fresh, and I think that makes sense now that you guys are coming from that world of pop and songs, and you brought that in a very organic way. It wasn't any intention. That's just who you were, and that I think that clicked. And obviously the notes and the theme, that. And the thing is, a lot of soundtracks have great themes, but they don't have good soundtracks. The thing with Speed and Twister, Lion King, Tarzan, all these, you can listen to the soundtrack entire day. Like it's the whole Bad Boys too, which you did, and that's remarkable. So I just wanted to mention that the entire soundtrack is something you can listen to while driving or going on a flight or something.
I don't remember who told me this. It might have been. I don't know who told me this, but I remember early on somebody told me it wasn't Zimmer because it was. If you can create a soundtrack that makes the movie better, and yet the soundtrack can live on its own away from the movie, then you've really hit it out of the park. And I think that's really true. And I think in a lot of areas that's gone because what's happened is there's been a stray away from thematic film scores or thematic scores, and more like mood and more like a vibe. Which is great. A mood is great. But when you take the music away from the film, it's just, there's nothing there, really. It's just kind of something where you kind of go, okay, well, it's okay. And I call it wallpaper. And I don't mean wallpaper in a bad way, because I've done it too. It's a different type of approach. And I've always had the approach, you know, I'm a songwriter, so for me, I love being able to take, for instance, if you listen to the overture to Speed, the opening, the drums sound like something Phil Collins would have done. I played it, but you know, I grew up on Phil Collins. I saw Phil Collins when he was 21 years old. When I was a kid, and I knew that style, so I was able to put that into the score of Speed, you know, and kind of cross. And I hadn't even worked with Phil yet, so it's that influence I think that we all had from, let's say, Kate Bush and Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins, all these people, kind of helped shape that landscape.
And one thing I wanted to comment on, you were talking about like the soundtrack living forever, right? You know,